Good afternoon. There, I can hear myself. I don't know if that's good or bad, but I can hear myself. So welcome. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Tim Tracy, Interim Provost. I'm here to talk today a little bit about the financial model that we're looking to go to here at the university and try to answer your questions. I have about half a dozen slides. I'll try to keep those relatively brief to allow more time for discussion and questions. I'll also do my best to answer your questions. If I don't know the answer, I will tell you I don't know the answer. I don't have all the answers. I do have some folks here who will help me, Lisa Wilson from the Provost Budget Office and Melody Flowers, Director of Financial Model Implementation, who will also help me out a bit as well. This is an odd room to present from, so you're going to have to bear with me. I also like to walk around a fair amount, so this is going to be a little bit of a challenge for me, getting around the pillars and so forth, but we'll try to make that. So, also for those of you who are watching streaming live, the Twitter handle and the email addresses should be there at the bottom of your screen. So please be sure to use those. They'll be monitoring those and they'll feed those questions in as well. And the second part is when we get to the question session, we have a couple microphones. And I'd ask you to wait until you get a microphone to ask your question so that those folks on the distant sites can also hear the question. And I won't have to repeat it that way, but so they can hear that question. Okay? All right, with that said, we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about financial models and our financial model system. But I believe, and the committee believes, that every model, regardless of what the model is, needs to start with your mission. And we need to make sure that it's based on the mission for the University of Kentucky. And I won't read you what it says there because you can obviously read it yourself or you can find it on our website. But I think we need to make sure that it focuses on our mission and the components of it, teaching, research, and service. And so all models should be based on that, how we best achieve our mission here at the University of Kentucky. So this is a value-based model. Some would also call it an incentive-based model. But it needs to make sure that we match our money with our mission. And so that we apply our financial funds, all funds, to the achievement of all components of our mission. And so what I want to do is take a few moments now and talk about the model that we're currently in and the model that we're looking to move to and how those begin to compare and contrast. We are currently in an incremental budgeting model, which means fundamentally that you get whatever you got last year, plus or minus a little bit that was changed by the state allocation or our revenues. Okay, so we get fundamentally whatever you got last year. Now, for units, and let me define what I mean by units. Unit can be a college or it can be a service unit. And I simply use that term because I have to deal with both. We have colleges and we have units. So to me, a unit, I'm not trying to be distinctive, but just simply say units. A unit then, under an incremental budgeting system, fundamentally manages to their expenses. They get money for direct expenses, as we'll show a little bit more in a moment, which includes things like salaries and benefits. And then they get current operating expenses, including travel, printing, communications, that type of thing. But they manage to expenses. They don't know, for instance, that if they do something differently, that they will get a different result. And I'll use colleges as an example. A college doesn't know that if they increase their enrollment by 50 students, that their budget would go up in relation to that increase in 50 students, or likewise if they decreased by 50 students, there would be a change in their budget. So it allows for a lot of stability, but it doesn't allow for a lot of planning, and it doesn't allow for a lot of thinking of new ways to do things. Now, there are some definite advantages to incremental budgeting. It is very consistent treatment of budgets over time because you get what you got last year, plus or minus a little bit, and unfortunately recently it's been mostly minus. But that also makes an assumption that your budget was correct to begin with. And that may or may not be true. But it is consistent. Second, they're very simple to understand because you really only manage the direct expenses of salaries and current operating expenses. So it's a fairly simple process. And assuming that you have the right budgets in all the units, it does provide for equity across the units because you're managing that in a relatively consistent fashion. But everything has pros and everything has some challenges with it, and so does incremental budgeting. For instance, it does require stability of funding and very consistent priorities. Okay, if funding's going down, then you know where your budget's going. But it also means that your priorities have to stay consistent because remember, you're giving what you gave last year plus or minus a little bit. So if you have major changes in priorities, it's very difficult then to make adjustments because everybody's getting what they got last year. And it makes it hard to adjust to those priorities, or even within your own budget. It makes it hard to adjust for changing priorities because your budget isn't going to change a lot. Secondly, it does need periodic rebasing to ensure that you have the adequate base and that it doesn't become an entitlement, that you have more base than you need or less base than you need. It can go either direction. So you need to go back and look at that periodically and say, is that unit appropriately funded for the mission that they're trying to carry out? Again, in our times recently, that's been a little difficult because it's generally been less money. And so it makes it harder even to do that adjustment. And then finally, it does encourage spending to maintain your budget because if you didn't spend it, then you must not have needed it. And so you end up encouraging the spending to justify the budget that you have. Okay. After a series of meetings this spring, and some of you, I recognize your faces, so I've seen you at other financial model meetings before in the spring that we held, town halls and so forth. You know that we went through a process of looking at what are our philosophies regarding budgets and mission and what we're trying to do here at the university. We also interviewed over 100 people. We had focus groups. We had a lot of things that went on. And folks really said that, the philosophies that they were saying mattered to them were things that matched more with a budget model that began to give incentives for doing the things that we value. And so we've been looking at a values-based model or an incentive-based model, and it has, like the incremental budget model, it has some, we'll call it benefits, and it has some considerations. So in the benefits, it does promote entrepreneurship because you do know now that if you do something that increases revenues, that those revenues will be associated with your unit, attributed to you. Again, go back to that model I said with the example with the colleges. You can know that then the dollars associated with that change in students will be associated with the change in your revenues. It does encourage or can encourage efficient administrative services because now you know what are the costs associated with those services. And let me talk a little bit more about that. And I'll go back to an example I had in the spring where someone raised their hand and said, I heard under these models that the taxes go up and up and up. Whereas associated taxes with administrative services. And I said, well, what are your taxes now? And that's the response I got. You don't know what your taxes are now. So you don't know if they're going up, going down, or staying the same. So it does put that out front so you know what those things are. And again, I'll show you that in just a few moments in an example. So you know what those are, but you also now have a way with some performance measures to hold those units accountable. But they also have the ability then to perform and get advantages as well because they have maybe beaten performance targets. And so for service units or administrative units, it can be also something that they can benefit from being more effective and being more efficient. Thirdly, it does align revenues with your costs. You see what your revenues are, all funds revenues, but you also see the costs. What are the costs associated with the registrar's office? What are the costs associated with administration, like the president's office or the provost's office? You begin to be able to walk through those and see what those are. And you can align your revenues with those costs. And it does facilitate conversations about priorities. And I'm sure we'll get some questions later on about how you don't incentivize behavior that you don't want. So that's really, it starts those conversations about what matters to you and what are the things and the decisions we make based on that. Now, it also has some considerations as well. One, incentive-based models do require strong central and local unit leadership. In fact, I would argue that strong leadership is key for any budget model that you have. It really doesn't matter what model. All good models can fail, or all bad models can do a little bit better if you have good, strong leadership. But the primary change for an incentive-based model is that there will be more decision-making at the local level. And so you will need more strong local unit leadership. It can be criticized, if not done properly, for replacing academic focus with a financial focus. In other words, people think it's all about making money. Okay. I would argue that we shouldn't be making widgets just because we can make money making widgets if those aren't part of our mission of teaching, research, and service. So you've got to make sure, this comes back to the question of priorities. What matters to you? And then you begin making decisions around that. Yes, we have a fly in the room that won't go away. And then it can, if again, proper incentives are not put in place, it can challenge academic collaboration because you've been saying, well, I can offer this rather than buying the services, so to speak, from another unit, so I'll just do it myself. If you don't, again, have good, strong leadership and the right principles and philosophies and rules in there, it can certainly do that. So there are pros and cons to any model, just to make sure that you have to get the one that's right for you. So let's walk through a hypothetical situation. If you are sitting here trying to figure out if that is your college, it ain't. Okay? These are made up numbers. So please don't try to back calculate and figure out if we're talking about you. It is a college, but it is a hypothetical college. Okay, let's walk through. I'm going to take the old model first. It's a little simpler, and walk you through what it looks like today in the old or the incremental budget model. Remember that this is an all funds model. Both of them are, in fact, an all funds model. But look at it now. It says program and course student fees, $200,000, clinical revenue, $500,000, gifts and investment income, $100,000, sales and services, $50,000, grants and contracts, $10 million, some mandated appropriations at $4 million, and some other income. That's true whichever model. Those are always associated with you now. You're always associated, your grants and contracts, your gifts, your sales and services, and any kind of student fees and clinical revenue. Those are associated with units today. The difference starts lying now below that when we simply now give you a state/tuition appropriation. You don't know how much is state, you don't know how much is tuition, but you know what the total is in aggregate because those are all put in a big pool of money and then allocated out to you. All right? And so in this hypothetical situation, it's $35,100,000 is the example because it has that state/tuition appropriation. Let's contrast that with how we would sort of account for everything in a values-based model. Well, the first 7 lines are exactly the same. You still have grants and contracts. You still have gifts. You still have sales and services. You still have clinical revenue. All those things are still there. But now, instead of a state/tuition-based budget or allocation, you are attributed your tuition and fees. Okay, and in this case, it's now $32,500,000 are your tuition and fees. And then you have state appropriations as a separate broken out line. And you have now FNA, which is facilities and administrative dollars, which is the indirect costs on grants and contracts. All right, so they're all attributed to you. Now, colleges won't be collecting tuition individually from each student, okay? Please don't start thinking that. It's attributed to you. And your first blush says, wow, we got a windfall. There's an extra $23 million there, right? 58 million versus 35 million. But remember, this is the revenue side of the equation. So now let's take the expense side. The first is direct expenses. In fact, direct expenses are exactly what you deal with today. It's those things like salaries and benefits, supplies, capital outlay, computer services, communications, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. They're all the same. Your direct expenses are your direct expenses. So in either model, the direct expenses are going to be the same, but the difference now comes in the allocated expenses. And this, again, is that greater level of accountability and transparency, because now you see that academic overhead, which in this example also includes financial aid, centrally allocated financial aid, is now $10 million of expenses to you. That was all, quote, taken off the top before. That's the difference between the 32.5 plus 7 plus 3.5 million and the 20 million. That's part of it. Administrative overhead, $4 million. That would be things, again, like the president's office, the university budget office, that type of thing, police, so forth. Campus affairs, $2 million. Research, $2 million. That's to run the research operation, like SPA, OSPA, those kinds of things. Those are real costs. And facilities and a strategic investment fund. Again, facilities being now your charge for the space that you occupy and the cost of keeping that up. Now, I could break those down into smaller and smaller categories, but for the illustration today, I think this works okay for broader categories. But now you begin to think about, well, if I occupy this much space, then I'm going to have X amount of cost associated with it. You also would now realize that as you increase those students, for example, that increases your tuition, there's also an increased burden on the system for registrar, bursar, the counseling center, those types of folks. So there needs to be additional expenses for that based on the number of students, for example. So you begin seeing that there are revenues but associated expenses, and you begin seeing those two linked together. All right. So the net result is then that the total allocated expenses are 23 million for a total expenses of 58 million. The other one just shows 35 million because you didn't get all that allocation to you in the first place. And so the net margin for both cases is $50,000. Now, lately we've let you keep your fund balances, but in this one you would definitely keep your fund balances in the incentive-based or value-based model until it got so large. If you made gazillions of dollars, we'd probably say, hey, you got gazillions of dollars, we probably need to do some reallocations. I'd like to have that problem. Those are great problems to have, but you can begin to see. So do you get an idea of how it now lays out the costs associated with running the university and begins to attribute those to the units that either that generate those services, and you begin to see how your decisions begin to affect that. So one of the questions that I get a lot is, how do colleges receive funding in the new model? Remember, I said you're not going to collect tuition each individual college, but that'd be a nightmare, trying to keep track of that. But you do receive it in two ways, on the front end and on the back end. The front end being relatively formulaic. In other words, you get X number, you get your tuition based on the tuition generated by what you do. You get state appropriations based on a formula usually. You're going to get grants and contracts. You already get those directly. And sales and services, gifts and endowments, and the facilities and administrative return that you get on your grants and contracts. The back end is the part that I want to spend a few moments talking about, because I sort of glossed over the strategic investment fund on the previous slide because I wanted to take this slide to describe it. The front end is all those things that come by the formula, but no model works totally formulaically. Okay? And let me explain what I mean by that. Our models look at a strategic investment fund, and we're trying to figure out what that investment fund looks like and how much it is. But fundamentally, it allows you to do several things. One, rebalancing or subventions. What do I mean by subventions and rebalancing? We know that there are some colleges whose revenues will not equal their expenses. Likewise, there are units that can't make revenue. So how do you begin to handle those things? And so remember, I talked about it's about our mission of teaching, research, and service. And so this allows you then to do some rebalancing of budgets where there isn't a positive at the end, but it's something that's important to what we do. Okay? It allows you to reward quality and success. If you do good things should happen. And there are ways to begin to reward that from this strategic investment fund. It allows you to have startup funds and invest in new priorities. You know, we're living in a very dynamic time. And I used to say, I don't know what 10 years looks like. I'm not sure I know what 1 year looks like in terms of what are the things that we need to be doing and where we need to be going. So it allows you some money to invest in those new opportunities. And one of the interesting concepts we've been talking about is a microfinancing pool. A pool of money where you can get $25,000, $50,000, or $100,000 essentially on a loan that you're going to return the investment by doing something good, and then revenues come in, and then you cover that, and then the university also benefits. So allowing folks to think of new projects with a little bit of startup for that and to carry them forward. So again, my point is that part of it's formulaic, and part of it is on the back end a little bit more subjective, but allows you to address priorities and make sure that needs are met. So it's not, again, the term every tub on its own bottom. We're not talking about every tub on its own bottom. We're talking about a university of the whole, and how do we adequately finance that. So I have some backup slides in case I need them, but I just want to take these few moments and begin to start the conversation, give you some things to think about. And the most important part is to spend the next hour and 35 minutes, if you desire to take that, I'm here, to begin to answer your questions as best as I can and begin talking through it, because it is a conversation. I will tell you from the meeting on Friday, it was a very good conversation. There were some outstanding questions asked, some things even brought up that I hadn't thought about. It's always good to hear new things, and things to make me think a little differently, look at things in a little different perspective. And so I'm hoping that the same thing comes from this, are also some interesting ideas that come out of it. So with that, I'll remind you again, we have microphones, and folks, a couple assistants. I feel like Oprah here, you know, we're going to run around with microphones. But I can assure you I don't have personal advice for you. I won't try to go down that road. I barely take care of myself. So no giveaways, no UGG boots. Wasn't that a big thing that Oprah gave away one year, was UGG boots or something for Christmas? I don't have any of those. So with that, I'll see questions, and I see one coming over here. Yes, sir.
Daniel Noss from the libraries. What aspect of a student will determine to what college his or her tuition dollars go?
So that's so let me rephrase your question a bit so I can expand on that. Is that okay?
Yeah, sure.
So the question is around tuition dollars and how you begin to allocate them. And let me give you some things to think about. So we know that students don't only take courses from the college in which they are enrolled as a major. Correct? So the question becomes, do you allocate the tuition based on the college of record? That would be where they're a major. Or the college of instruction, or a mixture of the two. So do you begin to say, well, and I'll give you an example that I just happen to know from personal experience. At Minnesota, 75% of the tuition goes to the College of Instruction and 25% goes to the College of Record. And they find that that works for them. At the University of Michigan, it's 50-50 because that works for them and how they're set up. So these are questions that the Model Implementation Committee is beginning to wrestle with and say, how does it also fit with our values? Because if we base it solely one way or the other, we could but we would make it more advantageous to keep everything to yourself versus work together collaboratively. And one of the things that we've heard time and time and time again was the value of collaboration and the collaboration across units and colleges. And so what we're looking at is how we put that in together to incentivize folks to work together and to not conduct behaviors that are perverse, if we can call it that. So we're actually walking through those kinds of things, and it's been interesting. We've had exactly that kind of a debate, and I think we're getting closer to what that might look like, but then we need to see how that falls out and what that works out. The other factor in there is cost of instruction. You know, if you're educating a cello major, I pick on cello majors just because it's an easy example to use, is that you don't say, well, we'll just put 60 in a room or 200 in a room, right? So it's got a higher cost of instruction associated with it. Likewise for physicians. Since I see Dr. Wilson sitting over here, I'll pick on physicians for a moment. And so you begin to think about that cost of instruction as well. So we're actually walking through all those things as to how we begin to allocate that. Now, I will say that there are two things about that. You know, we wouldn't want one college to start offering a course in something that's already offered in another college. And I say there are two ways to address that besides the financial part, and one is we have a faculty senate that approves all courses, right? And secondly, we should have strong leadership say, no, you're not going to offer cello for education majors, or I'm picking on something. You see what I mean? So you can begin to walk through that. So that's a very fair question, and I will tell you that we're walking through what those implications might be and how we can set that up for our values here at the University of Kentucky such that it matches the behaviors that we want to have happen. Close? Okay. I get a thumbs up. So he didn't throw anything. Life is good. Yes, sir.
I'm Jimmy Henning from the College of Agriculture, and I represent the Cooperative Extension, which is a large unit, but one that doesn't produce tuition. Right. Can you tell us how far along you are in thinking about the incentives for our unit and how we fit into this value-based model?
Sure. So the College of Agriculture has extension somewhere in the $60–70 million a year range, something like that. I will say that we have a number of units like that that don't, for instance, generate tuition dollars. Remember, this is an all-funds model. Let me go back to it being an all-funds model. But, for instance, the Center for Applied Energy Research is a research center that generates grants and contracts and some sales and services, but doesn't generate tuition as well. So we're walking through that, and that's one of the areas that's probably the most complicated to work through. Because of that, it's missing that one piece of revenue generation, but it has other pieces. And so you need to make sure that you have in place a system that values it and rewards it, but how you allocate that. And that will probably come down to some mixture of state appropriations, besides the mandated appropriations, and how you work through that and how you give them incentives for doing good things based on some performance metrics, and so a chance to grow a bit as well within that. We don't have that all worked out, but the conversations are very robust, we'll say, around that. Yeah. Again, I just don't have the final answer, but I'll tell you that we're walking through how you would handle something like that very well. The thing is, the nice thing is we have a number of land grants who've already done this and have done it some for 15, 20 years. And we can learn from them and begin to adapt it to, again, our philosophy and our needs, which are probably going to be a little bit different. You know, if you've seen one financial model, you've seen one financial model. And so you need to make sure that it matches for you. But it's a very good point, and we're trying to figure out exactly how to deal with that because, again, they don't have the tuition generation piece. But that would apply to, again, most research centers and units like that.
Betty Lorch from the College of Arts and Sciences. I had a question that was, I think there are aspects in the model that I can see that would deal with my question, but I'm still concerned about kind of how it might go.
Sure.
So just to take a specific example with research, FNA is in the model.
Right.
But we support a variety of kinds of research. Some of the work we do as a land-grant institution for the state doesn't come with FNA. Some very valid scholarship comes with a reduced rate of FNA. Are there, you know, it almost seems like the natural tendency then would be value some forms of research over other forms of research. How do we avoid doing that and really incentivize all of the important forms of research?
And thank you. And I'll actually even take that one step further. How do you work with colleges who do creative scholarship that doesn't generate much research dollars or FNA dollars? So take it one step further even, right? So the question of FNA is a very interesting one as you begin to walk through it. You know now that we are, in fact, using other dollars to cover that now, right? Because the cost is still there. The cost of the heat, the lights, the internet connections are all there. What we're hoping with this is that by attributing the FNA to you and then having some portion of that paid back as a participation fee for supportive research, it gives you incentives to generate more FNA, but it doesn't mean you as a college can't do the research that you want, because you get to make the decisions at a more local level versus a global or central level. So right now, maybe the second piece this is this only goes down to the college level. This isn't going down into departments, but just at the college level. So you will know now what your FNA return is. You'll know what your chargeback is for the research, and you can choose at the local level how to distribute that in your efforts. And right now it's sort of all hidden because it all stays centrally and then it's given out as about 15% comes back, 10% to the department and 5% to the college in terms of that. But you really, right now there's no incentive to bring in FNA. I mean, not a whole lot. 15% is pretty small return to you on that. What we're envisioning and what seems to be the general philosophy of the committee to date is a hybrid model, where in fact you have FNAs attributed to you, but now there's a research component that is for support of the research operation. There's a second component that is, again, would be a participation fee back to research for startups, but probably startups in some hopefully to be defined university areas of emphasis. And the third piece would be money to the research office for investment in new initiatives. So it would be a sort of a halfway in between. Instead of all 100% come to the units and then a small portion to go research, somewhere more toward the middle of that. So I mean, I think you raise a very fair point in terms of how do you look at that, but I think that also comes down to your local unit level as to how you wish to distribute your efforts and what you want to have as, we'll call it unfunded research as part of it, and research with or without FNA. Again, right now it's all sort of hidden behind. It sort of brings it out front and you can look at it a little bit closer and make your own local decisions on it. I think you as a unit can make that decision much better than I can. I mean, that's one of the things that I guess it may seem a bit odd to you, but I, as the interim provost, actually believe that you can make better decisions at your college level than I can. I don't know how to run your colleges, and I really don't want to run 16 colleges. So I think you're trying to get that at the local level to let you begin to make those decisions yourselves. Sure.
I appreciate that point. I think the part that puzzles me is when we're talking about making those local decisions, it's still with a certain amount of resources. And so, I mean, our college is a good example because we're very diverse. We have units who generate a lot of grants and contracts, and so there's plenty of FNA coming in. We also have units where those opportunities aren't there, but the research is just as valid.
Correct.
So although you can talk about making local decisions, and I can understand the value of all those pieces of research to make those decisions, at the same time the system seems to pull for us to almost put a greater value on the parts of the college that are generating the FNA. And I don't want to, the units that are not producing as much money may still be just as valid scholarship and just as important to the mission of the university.
Right, and I would hope within your unit you appreciate those differences. Again, I guess I'm more comfortable with you making that decision than me, because you know more at the local level how your units operate. I mean, I see your point, and I guess what I'm struggling with, and just being honest with you, what I'm struggling with is how I can make a better decision than you can about that. Because right now we really don't give you much FNA at all. You're assuming that we're making the right decisions. With 85% of it staying centrally, you're assuming that we're making the right decisions from that, and that you only have 15% to make decisions on. And I guess I'd like for you to have more control.
I understand that. I think it's more the sense that, in a way, we know that the FNA that, and this is university-wide, the FNA that we actually recover isn't really supporting that entire research mission. Is that correct?
It never does, yeah.
That's what probably is the disturbing part, that, well, where is that support going to come from if we're not recovering?
Yeah. And again, we'll go back to the SIF funding or the strategic investment funds, because that also does give the provost a chance to make adjustments based on that. Because again, there's some colleges that their funding sources don't give FNAs. And most of the research they do, a creative scholarship, does not generate even grant dollars sometimes. So it begins to allow you to do that through that strategic investment fund.
I'm Julia Smith Penny from the College of Design, and I have a question which is led off by what we've already been talking about. I'd like to ask what guidance you, the administration, has given about the process to help the deans and the local unit administrators consult with the faculty about setting these academic research priorities, discussing entrepreneurship and so forth. I mean, I've heard a lot from the recent meetings about how you are working with the deans, but I haven't heard very much about the process that you're giving to them to ask them to make sure to work with the other people in their units to see how all these decisions are being disseminated as well as discussed.
Sure. So I think your question relates to how we educate everyone about the financial model. Is that a fair way to rephrase it? Close enough? Okay. So I think I'd like to have all the answers for you and be able to roll it out and tell you what it is, but that also is not a participatory process as well. And so we're walking through that. And in fact, Monday, I'll be meeting with 2 different sets of deans to walk them through. I mean, they've seen this before, and walk them through even farther so that begin to educate them throughout the process. Melody has a business officers working group, which is a subgroup of business officers across the campus, beginning to educate them who can begin to educate others. We're trying to build a train the trainer kind of model for that so that we begin to work it out from there. Mass trainings of 400 and 500 probably won't work real well for this, but walking through that process in terms of the business officers, the deans, the department chairs. In fact, I have academic leadership, which is the deans and department chairs and center directors the week after Thanksgiving. And I'll be going through this with them again in more detail to begin to walk through that. And so they start seeing the components and begin to understand call it the levers that are in the model and how you begin to walk through that and begin to look at those decisions. So we're trying our best to walk through those different components with the different groups, and now we have enough detail to begin to do that. Before it was sort of philosophical, and at the philosophical level, everybody says, yeah, this sounds good, but I sort of need to see it operate. Now you've got a hypothetical that you can begin to walk through, and we're hoping that we can walk through them with that hypothetical and show what decisions make what changes so that they can walk through that. So that's our plan for beginning to disseminate it, is at the deans, but also at the chairs and the business officers, and start walking through that. So, and again, smaller groups that begin educating more small groups, and you begin to spread that out from there. Okay, good, sure.
What I'm concerned about is the faculty input process and how you have advised deans and or unit administrators to contact and work with the priorities of faculty and staff and other people who are at the level below this
Sure.
upper level administration.
Okay. So I'll take that question on two levels. One, there are faculty on this committee, but what you're talking about is at the local level, and I will continue to reinforce to the deans to continue to communicate or communicate better or whatever the case might be, and to bring it into those groups, because it is, remember, we're not taking this model all the way down into departments, but they are part of the college, that the college decisions then impact how those decisions affect your revenues and affect your expenses. So I will reinforce that again. Thank you.
Hi, Abby Hollander, Education Abroad Office. And you've talked about how the crux of the collaboration is based on good leadership, but I'm wondering if there are additional concrete incentives for continuing to maintain good working relationships with centralized units that serve all of campus, like Education Abroad,
Sure.
like the study, like the Career Center, or is it the idea that we might very well find ourselves having 16 studies and 16 Education Abroad units across campus
Sure.
eventually under the new model?
Sure. So I think you raised a very good question. I'll answer your question and probably even take it a bit broader. There are a couple ways to incentivize. For instance, I'll give you one example of colleges. You might say that you get 105 or 110% of your tuition if you work across colleges. So there's things like that you can do. With units, service units that don't generate revenues, you can have performance metrics, but also criteria that if you meet those metrics, then maybe something happens to your base funding as well, because you've now improved effectiveness and efficiency. The third piece is working with those, and I'm going to use IT as an example first, and then I'll come back to yours, so I won't throw you under the bus immediately. How's that? We would not want to have everybody contracting for their own internet service provider. As much as you might think that might save you money, and it might individually as a unit, we got a disaster if education chooses Insight and engineering chooses Windstream, and okay, you've got a disaster there. And so there's going to be some things that the decision's going to have to be made centrally that it's one. And likewise, I think units like the Education Abroad or the study or those, you've got to say this is for the good of the whole. And I think there are pieces that we're definitely going to have to walk through and say, this is about the whole. This is not about an individual. The same would be true of space. Since Wayne was glutton enough to sit through both of these sessions, I'll pick on Wayne for a minute. And, if you think about space and you start saying, well, what's the cost of space? And one number that, again, some of my previous experience is $28 per square foot. Okay. Well, then somebody raises their hand and says, I'm sorry, but I have office space, and that's much cheaper than that. Somebody else says, well, I have this type of space, and this department says, well, I got laboratories, and those are very expensive. We're probably going to spend more money trying to monitor all that and figure that out than we're actually going to save. So why don't we look at it as the good of the whole and say space is space is space, and we're going to just sort of spread it across everybody at some consistent number per square foot, instead of you get, yours is $14 per square foot because your office space, and this one's $35 because it's research, and this one's somewhere in between, and, that's probably going to be too complicated. So there's going to need to be some leadership in saying, this is what we're about. And we're not going to have 12 different programs of the same thing. But also you can put things in, again, to incentivize people to do that as well, to work together as well. Okay. Have I already worn you out? Jeez. I'll stay here till 3 o'clock or until you run out of questions. So I want to make sure you have opportunity to ask and provide some good feedback and ideas. We don't have all the answers. We're working through it. This is part of the process of working through it. Anything from the email or other accounts? Well, I must have put people to sleep. My students have accused me of that as well. So, yes. All right, brave soul.
I'm Suzanne Prevost from nursing.
Okay.
Can you speak to outcomes that have been achieved at comparable benchmark institutions that have implemented a similar model in recent years?
Sure. So here are some institutions that are out there. You'll notice that it covers a wide range. Public, private, land grant, non-land grant, small, large, all over the place. What they typically find is a much greater level of transparency because you now see it all out there. I mean, right now, again, what you see are your direct expenses that come from, for instance, college comes from the provost office. And you don't know everything else that went on before that. Many of them, again, I'll go back to, I'm sorry to use my previous experience, but full disclosure, I was at the University of Minnesota, or Minnesota. But I'm from Southern Ohio, so it's more like Minnesota and 8 and that kind of thing. But my experience there was it allowed us to really think strategically and begin to decide where our values were within our college that fit with the university's values. And so we did very well under that model because we could make decisions and knew what was going to happen with those decisions and begin to plan. So we could actually make real substantive decisions that allowed us to really position the college much better and the university level. So if you don't do it right, you can have problems, just like you can in an incremental model. But again, the ones who monitor the model, assess it every 3 to 5 years, course correct as course corrections need, typically do pretty well. And then the big piece is the transparency and the planning. And that's at least what I've experienced. Oh, hey, just a second. Wait for the microphone. You got to be on TV.
Among these institutions who've used this model, can you tell a little bit, or do you have a sense of how much of their fiscal resources are included for these campus-wide organizations or programs? So, you know, we've heard about taxing, and so the units would be taxed for the services provided by the counseling center or education abroad.
Right.
So what is the typical percentage by which those units are supported?
As I recall, it's in the 35 to 40% range, Melody, somewhere in the neighborhood. Yeah, she's got it. She's sick, so I'm going to have to come closer so I can hear her and repeat it. Yeah. Yeah. So the answer is it's always it varies, right? But that's a bad answer. So how you choose the model, in other words, what you say is, for instance, state appropriations and how those are allocated, how you choose how all the revenues, and do you keep part of the tuition centrally? Some keep 10, 20% off the top of tuition and keep it centrally. So it kind of depends on how you make those decisions. That's why I kind of use the 35% range is, again, based on an average, which, you know, average goes within the two extremes. But it's really how you begin to base your model. So do you say, well, we're going to keep 10% of all tuition for centrally funded programs? Well, then that would mean less taxes because it's already taken off on that part. So it depends on how you put that together. But what is true of most of these that have been benchmarked, virtually all of them, is that that level that you guess on taxes or participation fees doesn't seem to change a lot as you look at it over time. It really doesn't bounce a lot. You might think there'd be wild swings. It doesn't seem to be that way. 2 or 3 percentage points one way or another, because generally most institutions, and we're doing the same thing, go through it really in detail. You really walk through it, and you actually have your past numbers as a guidepost, right? I mean, even though you don't know what they are, we can go back and calculate those. So we have a guidepost, and if it comes up and we say, it's somewhere out here and it's been here, we got to ask ourselves a question. Are we using the right things? Are we putting the right things in? But how you choose those, again, that's why we're trying to develop our model, not taking any one of these as the cookie cutter and plunk it in, because I wouldn't want to take a non-land grant and put it here. I mean, that would be not a good thing, because that's a whole different animal. And so private, you wouldn't want to put a private model on top of it. But we're trying to keep it relatively simple. You notice I only put about 5 buckets of expenses in there, 5 or 6. I'd rather you all not spend your time thinking about, oh gosh, you know, the registrar's office or the bursar's office or facilities or something. It's just, you know, that's probably, I'd like to focus on the revenue side and not so much on the expense side. We want to watch our expenses, don't get me wrong. But I'd rather units begin thinking about revenues, and let's just take care of the expenses in an appropriate fashion. These are good questions.
So I'm curious about how this is all being shared with the students, and if there's any anticipated impact on the students directly. One thing that I have a fear of is that there's going to be additional fees for X, Y, and Z each time you do something, and there might be the sentiment of nickel and diming people out, you know, from the student perspective, not necessarily from the college perspective.
Sure. And I actually have that worry every day, this model or any model. You know, that the president, for a reason, said that fees can't go up more than 2% when we had the budget reductions for exactly the reason you're talking about, that you make up for your budget reduction by changing student fees. And so that's why he put that in place. So have we shared it with the students? Not yet. I would hope that it would be transparent to the students, that they don't know any difference. If we do it well, it shouldn't impact them in any way but positive, because they see good things happening. But we need to be careful of that. I guess my question, I'll sort of flip it back to you, is how would you share this with the students so you get the best input possible and explain it to them such that you get what you need from them? What would be the questions you'd ask them, I guess? So I'm pleading ignorance here. I'm asking for advice. How would you share that with the students to get the feedback? I mean, you all think in one set of terms. They're going to think in an entirely different set of terms. What would be the frame of mind for that? I'm not trying to put you on the spot. I'm really sincerely trying to ask. So if I did this, I'd do it in the right way and not assume it from some wrong perspective. Sure. Mm-hmm. Did you have a comment on this suggestion? Can you share the mic with him, this gentleman? I saw Karen's hand, but I think you're asking a separate question, so here we go.
Again, we're in the College of Ag, so we've got faculty with different appointments right in the same hallway. Mm-hmm. So the question from the thought that I would ask a student is, tell me about the model, if I'm a student, I would say, would I have access to each one of those people down the hall? One's a instruction budget, one's a research, one's an extension budget. And because all of those, I believe, in our college, to some degree, may have the ability to impact the quality of an educational experience.
Sure. Yeah, fair. And again, I hope we don't take this down to the college, or to the department level, but does that. So I think it from what I'm hearing, and so what I'm sort of thinking out loud is, We need to make them understand that we're trying to be more transparent and accountable. We're trying to manage their money as well as possible, and to try to to maximize the experience for them. And here are some key points along that way. I mean, the one thing that first they're going to care about is tuition, the second's fees, and the third's financial aid. Maybe not necessarily in that order, but if I were a student, those are the three things I'm going to think about: tuition, fees, and financial aid. I wish they also thought about, and can I get the right courses I need in the sequence to finish in 4 years, but I can't get them quite to think there. We'll work on that. But, you know, it's starting walking through that process. But thank you for helping me begin to think through it, because I'm trying to figure out how I would engage them in a discussion that's good for them and valuable for us, other than just a time that we talked with them. You know, that's nice, but does that get us, either one of us, where we want to get to? Okay, Karen?
Karen Lewis, Director of Academic Enhancement in Undergraduate Education. I apologize, I also am ill, so I don't sound like myself. My question is, as we transition to a new budget model, granted there are units and endeavors that we have undertaken in the past under unsustainable models of budgeting, or underfunded, and then at the end of the year, if there's any balance somewhere, cover those costs. During the transition, how do you envision not losing some valuable components of what we do for students across colleges? And I'm not just talking about my own unit. As we transition, I've seen a proposal where it's going to be a parallel budget for a year. Can you talk a little bit more about the transition and how we make sure we don't do more harm than good in the process?
Yeah, and that's the number one goal, is to do good. So typically what is done, and what we envision, is a parallel process, or some call it a hold harmless year, where you go through the year operating under your old system, but you look and see what the new system would have meant for your unit, and then you true those up at the end and make sure that, again, you're starting from that proper base. And so you walk through that so that you don't say, flip a switch, and on July 1st, you're suddenly under this new model, and we don't have any experience with it, but we'll see what happens. You got to stay away from that. And so you typically run a parallel process year where you walk through that and say, here's what would have happened based on the decisions you made, and now you've got time to begin thinking about those decisions and look and see if it's behaving as you expected it to behave. And you may need to make a few adjustments even in there of things that you just could not predict or didn't think about, and so you begin to make those adjustments before you start full-fledged into it. So you kind of walk through it stepwise. So we have financial data from FY11. We're now putting in data from FY12. And so we can actually walk through. Now, we don't have the model finished, so please don't think that. But as we walk through, now we've got 2 years of data that we could see how the two compare, and then begin to talk about FY13 budgeted, which is what we're in now. And then you look at FY14 budgeted, and you can begin to make some predictions and see what's going to happen with certain decisions. So we actually have some significant data behind us that we can begin to walk through. And so Roxanne's pulling some of that data, 180,000 lines, I believe, of data. It's a pretty big Excel spreadsheet. Kristen's given her some help with that. And so we're walking through that and trying to say, here's what it means. And we have some we have a spreadsheet built, but we don't know what are the choices at different levels, and we're walking through those choices, and what does that mean? Sure.
And that makes sense. For units that have been operating on a deficit budget for some time, or units or programs that are grant funded and then the grant is being reduced annually, and yet there hasn't been a plan for how the university is going to make up for what the grant is no longer going to pay for. How do we protect those vulnerabilities?
Sure. Or programs that have been operating off of non-recurring funds. So it forces us to make those decisions and think about them and begin walking through that, because it does make you make those decisions and begin to think about how to protect them. Again, we've got to look at our mission and look at our priorities and say, does this fit with our mission and with our priorities? And if it does, then you begin making decisions about making that recurring and walking it through. So there's some good sides to it. It may be a little painful, but there are good sides to forcing you to walk through those and say, you know, we've been doing this with non-recurring funds for 4 years. We need to make some decisions here. And so you begin to walk through it and say, is this what we need to do? And if it is, then you make those decisions to make sure it's funded. There's one right here.
Hi, I'm Tony Ralph from Student Affairs. And I was wondering, it seems like there's the potential under this kind of model for there to develop a level of competition between the colleges for students. And in looking at the other universities that have done this, what kind of ways have there been to keep that from becoming an unhealthy kind of competition where colleges are vying for students and trying to get them to?
Well, again, you've got to, I'm going to take it to a more global level, then I'll take it down to a more local level. One, you know, you've got to think about enrollment management. Enrollment management at the university level and enrollment management at the collegiate level. And I think those are conversations that we should always be having, is enrollment management at the university level and then how that interfaces with enrollment management at the local unit level or college level. That's the first piece. The second piece is competition for students. You know, a capitalist would say that they go to the program they favor the most and they vote with their feet. And so that's one part of it, but you've got to make sure that that unit has the resources to adequately educate them. And so it goes back to enrollment management. But the other issue is, then again, how do you set those relationships between the College of Instruction and the College of Research? I can tell you that, you know, you admit students in one college, and because we value a broad education, that impacts on another college because they take courses across colleges. Comes back again to enrollment management and walking it through with those discussions. And what I envision is, again, robust discussions all year long about here are resources, here's what this means if we get this many students, and here's how we need to walk through that. And so that you have those honest decisions between the local units and the central global look at things, so you begin to walk through it. But the other way to sort of deal with that competition is have the College of Instruction versus College of Record and how the tuition gets allocated. Again, you know, as an example, we have a physics department in the College of Arts and Sciences. Well, then engineering could say, well, I want to teach physics because all of our students have to take physics and we can collect the tuition money. Well, again, I'll go back to we have a faculty senate whose job is to approve all new courses. And two, we should have a provost who sits and says, not the thing to do. We got a good physics department. Not the way to make money. Think a little differently. You sat right in the middle, see? I probably don't even need it. Well, just for the people out in the hinterland. We had people watching from the western part of the state on Friday from one of the extensions. I pity them because apparently I was on a big screen. That's got to be frightening. So I pity them. Go ahead.
Daniel Noss from the libraries again. I'm curious about how the transfer of funds from academic units to non-academic units. If there'll be some overarching body to kind of determine percentages of what gets transferred, or if it will be up to, for example, the libraries and the College of Arts and Sciences to negotiate a cost of what each unit feels is fair.
Sure. So that's part of what this committee is beginning to walk through are the types of choices that would be made. Ultimately, the decision is the president's. The president will approve any model that we come up with, and it's his decision as to what it looks like. But typically, it's not done. The library's charge, sorry to say charge, but I've got to say that. The library's charge is universal for everybody. It's not different for one college or another. Now, that doesn't mean two deans couldn't get together and say, we want to develop a dual degree program. Let's figure out a way how to split that. I don't want to stop that at all. That's a good thing to say, hey, let's create a dual degree because we think this will be very marketable, and here's how we'll deal with the tuition. That could be done. But things like libraries, IT, and so forth, those are generally based on things like head count, number of students, whatever it might be, and they're the same all the way across. I envision that there's probably going to be this financial model implementation committee may morph into a financial model advisory committee that advises the provost and president and monitors the model and helps them. But again, ultimately, it's the president's decision, and he or she can choose to delegate that down to the provost for certain things and so forth, and whatever they might be. But that's who ultimately makes the decision. But again, it's usually the same across all units.
Hi, I'm Ruth Bryan, and I also work in the libraries, so I have a follow-up question to that. Will there be an opportunity or an expectation that units that are not tuition generating will need to make presentations or sort of determinations within the unit for how our value is, perhaps per student or per groups of students, to sort of move forward to the model, the budget allocating group?
Sure. And that's part of what we're sitting down with all those units, and we're walking through, again, what their finances look like and what this would mean for them if we made certain decisions and getting input on all that. And again, we're starting with the colleges. We have 14 of the 16 on Monday or something like that in 2 groups. We're walking through, because again, that's where most of at least of the provost area budget, that's where most of our money is in the colleges, and walking through that. But we're sitting down with all of those units and walking through over time as we begin to walk through it, what that means and how it affects them and what decisions we're thinking about and what their input is into that. Dr. Lorch.
Betty Lorch, again, College of Arts and Sciences. I also had a question about how funds for graduate education figure into this model. Many of our graduate programs don't generate additional tuition dollars coming in because of the nature of funding and the way we attract graduate students.
Sure.
But again, this is an important part of our mission as well and part of the prestige of the university. How does that get represented, or what's the thinking on that so far?
So we've been trying to walk through that a bit because graduate, it's complicated. And I'm sorry to say what is a cliche, but you're right. Many of the graduate students don't pay tuition. They're covered on grants, or they're covered on some state programs. There's an exempt tuition for state employees who wish to get certain degrees and so on and so forth. So it's rather complicated to walk through that. I mean, the simplistic answer is to say, again, you're getting all your revenues attributed to you, and then how you wish to disperse those revenues among your programs with, again, the costs of the allocated expenses is one way to look at that. What we're trying to figure out is what is that implication for graduate education, and we don't know that yet. I mean, that was most of an hour and a half discussion, is how do we walk through that, because it's not as directly attributable as is, for instance, undergraduate or professional tuition that we know the students pay it. But graduate students are not always that way. Some do. There's some programs that the students pay the tuition and it goes. Others, we choose to use funds from various sources to support graduate education, which helps teach, which helps do research, and this carries out as part of our mission. And how do we begin to walk through that, and what does that mean for an individual unit? I mean, it's similar to your question you asked before. We're taking it down to the college level, but helping at that level begin to think about those processes, because now it's them making that decision. I'm unbeknowingly making that decision for you now in terms of what I give you in an allocation based on what it was last year. I'm in fact making that decision for you, whether I realized it or whether you realized it. I'm making that decision for you. This gives it more clarity around it, and hopefully, but again, graduate education piece is more complicated because, again, there's grants and contracts that pay for that. There's using our general funds to pay for that. And there are these exempt tuition cases. And so what does that mean? Because how we deal with that for some units will have substantial implication, where they have, for instance, the exempt tuition, that they have to take the student who meets the minimum qualifications because of a state law. That has very serious implications for some units, and so we've got to walk through that very carefully. And we're trying to figure out what's the magnitude of that, and then what happens with that. Yeah. Karen? See, if I stand here and stare at you long enough, you feel guilty, and so you ask me something. That's what I always tell the students. You know, I've given thousands of lectures. I can stare you in the eye until you ask me a question.
Well, this is more a comment. I was just sitting here thinking, we employ graduate students to provide a lot of service to our unit. And in a way, I kind of look at it as they're paying their tuition through service to the university. And is there some sort of formula or equation that we can consider for graduate students are actually paying tuition, but it's not dollars and cents they're paying. They're paying what we would otherwise have to pay someone to do.
Sure. That's the same as the TAs.
Yeah.
One could argue that a TA is paying that through service as well. That's, again, what we're trying to walk through is what does that mean when you now realize that all those components are there. Before, I don't think we really thought about it. It just sort of worked out in the end. And now as we begin to think about it, what do we value? How do we match our money to mission for what we value? So, yeah, I agree with you. Yes, sir.
Bob Lorch in Arts and Sciences. I wanted to add
Do
one
you know
more.
her?
Yeah,
No.
yeah, I happen to know her. I wanted to add one more thing to the discussion. We've been talking very much in terms of sort of value. How do we value these different things? One thing that hasn't been mentioned is if there were drastic drops in the support of our graduate students, you would lose a lot of faculty members because they would no longer be able to do what they want to do here. They come here because it's a research-intensive university. If we lost, say, half our graduate students, we would lose a sizable portion of our faculty as well. I don't know how you figure that out when you start adding the numbers.
Yeah. I wish I knew the answer to tell you how to figure that out. I can tell you we're thinking about it. I'll tell you we're also thinking about how do you in fact do part of this as a rolling average? You know, let's take the tuition number, for instance. That's the one everybody likes to think about because it's the easiest to think about. It's the easiest to measure kind of thing. But do we, in fact, use a 3-year rolling average for it versus whipsawing up and down? Same kinds of issues of how you begin to think through this so that you don't go up and down a lot. But again, the graduate education piece is something that I'm trying to get my head around. And I know the committee's trying to get their head around as well, because it's not as simple. It's not that straight. They pay the tuition, we collect the tuition, it's there. It's much more complicated because there is the service component, or I'd call it training component in terms of teaching them how to teach. There's the component of assisting in our research, and then there's the grants and contracts piece with that. So I can tell you that the committee is wrestling with this a lot and trying to figure out how to get it right and not just willy-nilly throw it up in the air and see what falls down, but trying to walk through it very carefully and discussing that because it's an important component. It's part of our mission. So how do we begin to account for that and make sure it's adequately resourced? Yeah. I wish I could give you a definite answer, but I hear your concerns. We share your concerns, and we're trying to walk through that. There are plenty of advocates for graduate education on the committee, trust me. Myself being one of them.
Karen Ramage with Cooperative Extension. And I guess I would ask for a little more clarification on how you determine what we value and who do you mean by we? Are we talking about students? Are we talking about faculty? Are we talking about citizens of Kentucky, you know, and how we merge that into what do we value?
Well, certainly we have a mission statement, we have a vision statement here at the university. I would hope it starts with that. It's one reason I showed it as the first thing. And then it begins going down, and I'd hope at each of your units, not necessarily at the department level, but at least at the college level, have a strategic plan with a vision and mission. And hopefully they are congruent with the universities. And likewise, then if you start parsing that out, you begin to see the pieces that relate to students, the pieces that relate to service, teaching, research, creating new knowledge, and walk through that. So I think it becomes a partnership. I mean, that's a partnership of all those people to begin to put that together in light of the university's mission and what we're trying to accomplish. So it's got to have those discussions, and we've got to keep those discussions going. You know, our strategic plan is from 2009 to 2014. It's time to start planning again, whether you want to accept that, realize it or not. This is November 2012, and I would argue to come up with a university strategic plan, it's time. It's time to do that, because 2014 is not that far away. And so I think that helps us also further clarify those things. Well, you've tied the other group. We're now at an hour and 15 minutes, so it depends on whether you want to win or not. Okay. All right, a couple closing comments then. One, again, thank you for coming. Thank you for participating, for your honest and insightful questions. They do mean a lot to us. I've watched folks over there feverishly typing away, keeping track of the questions, because we'll continue to use these. It's an important process, but it's one that we take very seriously. And we're trying to do good things for this university, as I know all of you are as well. That is the goal, is to make this a greater place. It's a good place now, and I think we can be even better, and we can achieve even greater things. And so I look forward to working with you over the next months and even a few years on this financial model as we begin to put it into place. You know, you can always contact me, or you can contact Melody. melody.flowers@uky.edu or tim.tracy@uky.edu. We'll listen. We'll try to get back to you. We get a lot of stuff, so we don't always get back to everybody. But we'll do our best and try to walk through this as best as we can. So I thank you for taking time out. I wish you a happy Thanksgiving. Please enjoy your families and friends, and I will do the same. Thank you.